You do have no idea how Darwinian evolution works.
I have a basic idea, that's it. If you're going to question me...
Okay, let's check your basic idea. What's your basic idea?
Natural selection through mutation, that's the basic idea.
Natural selection through mutation. Let me just tell you something. I'm not someone who gets angry often, but I'll tell you something that just really me off. When somebody tries to make claims and you shoot down those claims, and then as you've beaten them on the floor, they decide to shout something back at you, like, huh, what did you say? And then they try and defend themselves. So you're telling me the basic that you understand about Darwinian evolution is this. It's natural selection plus mutation. Well, guess what? That's not even Darwinism. It's natural selection plus random mutations.
So what?
If it's natural selection plus mutations, guess what it becomes? Epigenetics, orthogenetic evolution. So even though you were slapped on the floor, you said, no, I do understand something. I'm just going to tell you, this is what I understand. Two friggin' terms, mutation and natural selection, and you still got it wrong.
Whew. We'll get to that guy here in a minute.
Darwinism is a religion, a belief system that's taken by faith. And I'm not complaining about religions and taking things by faith. Rather, I'm saying Darwinists have taken up the wrong religion and they don't realize that they're operating by faith. And the faith of Darwinism has its own creation myth in which intelligent adaptations within highly complex functionally integrated systems just happen for no particular reason. Fred Hoyle illustrates the impossibility of this with his famous analogy of a tornado passing through a junkyard and leaving behind a Boeing 747. And the ancient Roman orator Cicero had his own version. You throw down a bunch of alphabet letters and they land as a finished copy of the Annals by Ennius. But epic poems and 747s don't come into existence by themselves, no matter how much time you give it, and neither do living cells. But Darwinists believe. It's a faith.
Huh. Well, hi there. My name is Clint LOVES. I'm an evolutionary biologist. I study evolutionary ecology and evolution acceptance through teaching. And recently I've been engaging with content like this in an attempt to not only correct some common misconceptions about evolutionary biology, but also to model a better way of engaging with people that disagree with you. And I want to dive right into that clip that we just saw. In that clip, the speaker declares that what he calls Darwinism is itself a religion. He claims that this religion has its own creation myth in which intelligent adaptations within highly complex functionally integrated systems just happen for no particular reason. And he likens this to a tornado passing through a junkyard and leaving behind a 747, or throwing down a bunch of letters and having them land as the Annals by Ennius. And he concludes that epic poems and 747s don't come into existence by themselves, and neither do living cells. But Darwinists believe that they do because Darwinism is a faith, as opposed to, I would assume, a legitimate branch of science. And I think that in order to assess these claims that he's made, we probably need to understand what he means by belief and faith, as well as Darwinism. So I'll begin by saying that he seems to be inferring that people that accept evolution accept it without reason. That the belief that biological evolution is true is based in faith by the definition of belief without proof. And while we could argue that proof is not really part of science, I think this is about as far as we need to wade into a discussion of semantics. To put it into the most palatable terms for someone like myself, without so much controversial language, I would say that he is saying that people accept biological evolution without sufficient evidence to support such acceptance. And that makes it more of a belief system than a scientific position. And I disagree, though I too am not a person who has a major problem with faith or belief. I mean, accepting anything requires a certain amount of trust and belief in things about which you cannot be absolutely certain. But there is good reason to accept evolutionary theory as being the best model we have ever had for explaining the diversity of life on Earth. However, I personally am not closed off to the potential that I could be wrong, at least if a strong case is made against it. In this case, he backs up his claims with analogies to a tornado in a junkyard and letter tossing. And he is right that the tornado will likely never create a 747, nor the tossed letters epic poetry. I've also heard similar arguments about an explosion in a print shop, creating a dictionary or the works of Shakespeare. And again, this also does not happen. But this has nothing to do with the origin of cells, and the origin of cells actually has little to nothing to do with biological evolution. He's actually making an argument against the spontaneous generation of life from non-life, which is abiogenesis, and not the Darwinian model of evolution by means of natural selection. And that's a good idea, at least if you like straw man arguments, because there is much less evidence for how we got the first cells than there is for how we got from single-celled life to the diversity of life on Earth today. And if there are people that have very specific and firm positions about the exact mechanism by which the first life originated on Earth, I would agree with him that those are likely beliefs very much like what he's accusing them of being. Now, just because we don't know something doesn't mean that it has a supernatural explanation. That is the concept of God of the gaps, the notion essentially that God is the explanation for all that we don't yet understand in the universe. But in my opinion, that's a very silly concept. There is much that we understand about the universe that we didn't understand 50 years ago. The gaps, they just keep getting smaller. And that has little to nothing to do with whether or not the supernatural or God exist. The existence of a God or gods is not predicated on how well we understand the natural world. So while we have many reasonable, at least partial explanations for how life may have originated, we don't know. We may never know. It's an extremely challenging question to address for many reasons, not the least of which being that there cannot possibly be fossils of the moment life originated, and it may have only happened once in the whole history of Earth, several billion years ago under conditions that we poorly understand. Even if it happens every few days somewhere on Earth, what are the chances that we would be able to observe it occur? It's a difficult question, and most importantly, not Darwinism. Darwin's explanation doesn't begin until two things were present in the world. First, life. And second, heritable variation. Darwinism is not an explanation for the origin of either of those things. Darwin did not know much about how life or variation came to be. But by the time Darwin came onto the scene, it was pretty clear from the fossil record that life changes over time. The question was just why and how. And Darwin's explanation was natural selection, which is an evolutionary mechanism, but not the only mechanism of evolution. And I'd like to explain natural selection as clearly as possible because it really is very simple, and it almost certainly occurs. Even most young Earth creationists accept that it occurs. But like I said, it assumes that two things exist: self-replicating life and heritable variation. If all life forms are the same, then the population cannot change over time. But if there is heritable variation, it is very likely that some variants will work out better in a given environment than others. Like how a brown and black snake might do better in a brown and black environment than would a white snake. And by do better, I mean reproduce more than would a white snake in the same environment. And since this coloration is heritable, meaning that it can be passed on to future generations, the genetic variants that code for this coloration should become more and more common in the population relative to the genetic variants that code for this one. This evolutionary change due to natural selection is known as adaptation. And this adaptive change can cause a population to change over time. A little over short periods and more over long periods. Today, not only is this supported by evidence, but so much that most creationists even accept that this occurs, as we explained in this video, where we presented our steel man of the creationist position. So Darwinism is not only something that we do not need to take on faith, but it's not really questioned even by creationists. Many question how much total change is possible, and that the Earth is not old enough to result in major change, but that natural selection occurs is generally considered self-evidently true. And that is the big difference between how we would get from primitive cells to a diversity of life from how we would get from a tornado to a 747. There is no known mechanism for making a 747 from strong winds and garbage. But there is a clear mechanism for how we get from one type of life to multiple and different forms of life. So trying to claim that the impossibility of one has any bearing on the possibility of the other is just false. Just because hammers can't give birth to hammers doesn't mean that humans can't give birth to humans. And just because Throwing letters doesn't create a specific book, doesn't mean that life can't change and diversify as a result of non-randomly unequal reproductive success in populations. And even if the first cell was created by God, specially and without any natural explanation, that wouldn't mean that Darwin was wrong, because that wasn't even what Darwin was attempting to explain. And if someday we have a great handle on the natural mechanism by which the first cell was created, that wouldn't have anything to do with whether or not a god or gods exist. So this seems like a pretty baseless attack meant to upset secular people that consider faith to be beneath them, and to make people of faith think that there is no objective reason to accept evolution without even addressing anything about evolution. So it's kind of silly. Did you know that China has an artificial sun? No, really, scientists just set a record by sustaining a 17-minute plasma reaction. That's pretty incredible. When it comes to science, history, and even topics like evolution or creationism, media coverage can be wildly inconsistent. Different outlets highlight different aspects of the same story, and sometimes bias and misinformation creep in. So how do you get the full picture without getting lost in a sea of headlines? That's where Ground News comes in, the sponsor of today's video. It's an app and website that gathers every article on a story in one place, so you can see all perspectives, compare biases, and get to the truth. Take the artificial sun story, for example. Ground News shows how over 10 sources have covered it. But here's the thing. Depending on which news source you read, this breakthrough is framed in completely different ways. Some focus on the scientific achievement, while others bring up geopolitical concerns or even conspiracy theories. By using Ground News, you can compare headlines, check each source's factual rating, and filter by bias, so you're always getting the full picture. One of my favorite features is the blind spot feed, which shows stories underreported by one side of the political spectrum. This way you can catch major discoveries or even controversies you might have missed. I love using Ground News because it helps me think critically about the information I consume. Whether you're diving into the creation versus evolution debate, scientific breakthroughs, or just want to see how different sources frame the same event, Ground News makes it easy. Right now, as a Clint Reptiles fan, you can get 40% off the Vantage plan, which is only $5 a month, using my link ground.news/Clint. That's unlimited access to every feature, including bias ratings, source comparisons, and the blind spot feed. So if you want to see the full picture, go to ground.news/Clint or click the link in the description to check out Ground News today. All right, so we're back to this guy.
You don't have no idea how Darwinian evolution works.
I have a basic idea, that's it. If you're going to question me...
Okay, let's check your basic idea. What's your basic
Natural
idea?
selection through mutation, that's the basic idea.
Natural selection through mutation. Let me just tell you something. I'm not someone who gets angry often, but I'll tell you something that just really me off. When somebody tries to make claims and you shoot down those claims, and then as you've beaten them on the floor, they decide to shout something back at you, like, huh, what did you say? And then they try and defend themselves. So you're telling me the basic that you understand about Darwinian evolution is this. It's natural selection plus mutation. Well, guess what? That's not even Darwinism. It's natural selection plus random mutations.
So what?
If it's natural selection plus mutations, guess what it becomes? Epigenetics, orthogenetic evolution. So even though you were slapped on the floor, you said, no, I do understand something. I'm just going to tell you, this is what I understand. Two friggin' terms, mutation and natural selection, and you still got it wrong.
Whew, that was aggressive. So here we have a discussion between this hostile gentleman and someone who confesses to having a rudimentary understanding of evolution. The hostile gentleman, who is the one who posted this video, tells the other man that he has no idea how Darwinian evolution works. To which the man with the basic understanding of evolution states that his understanding of evolution is limited to the concepts of natural selection through mutation. To which the hostile gentleman responds that that's not even Darwinism. And he clarifies that Darwinism is natural selection plus random mutations, and that natural selection plus mutations is epigenetics, or orthogenetic evolution. And then he went on to belittle the man a little more. There is a lot to discuss here. For starters, we already discussed what Darwin understood about evolution earlier. He understood natural selection on heritable variation. He didn't really understand mutation, random or otherwise. So the understanding of this guy, who doesn't even claim to understand evolution well, is actually a bit more precise than Darwinian evolution. The combination of our understanding of natural selection and genetics is generally called neo-Darwinism. So actually, neither of these guys are actually talking about Darwinian evolution. As for the randomness of mutations, that is a silly place to berate someone, especially if you're incensed that they left the word random out of the use of mutation to describe the role of mutation in evolution. We have no evidence that mutation is a wholly random process. For example, natural selection even acts on the prevalence of mutations in populations, as well as what segments of DNA are most likely to experience mutation. For example, sharks are notorious for not getting cancer. Cancer is caused by mutations to the DNA that cause cells to begin dividing rapidly. And it isn't that sharks don't get cancer, they do, but cancer is very rare in sharks because their mutation rates are very low. The shark body plan is virtual perfection in an environment that historically does not change rapidly. Thus, any change to their genome is generally worse than what was there before. And so the mechanisms that recognize and repair errors in genetic copying are very good. Selection has favored this. And their mutation rates are non-randomly very low. However, for populations that live in rapidly changing environments, low mutation rates generally mean extinction. So selection favors repair mechanisms that are nowhere near as good at their jobs as they are in sharks. Additionally, mutations are not equally likely in all regions of the genome. Often less essential regions of the genome experience higher mutation rates than more essential regions. There is no evidence that mutations occur in response to a specific need for a mutation. In fact, this reality is why extinctions occur, but they aren't wholly random. However, our understanding of mutation is that which mutations occur at a given time are random in that while we can predict the likelihood of a mutation and where it is most likely to occur in the genome, we cannot predict exactly which mutation will occur. And I think this is what he was getting at when he became incensed that the word random wasn't used. And I think that the cranky man got so cranky because he wanted to talk about epigenetics and orthogenetic evolution. Because he is saying that natural selection through mutation, if random mutation is not specified, is epigenetics or orthogenetic evolution. And I'll start with orthogenetic evolution, which is the idea that evolution progresses towards some specific objective, such as increased complexity. This would require some intelligence or other force directing the genetic change in the population towards this goal, non-random mutations. Which, if this first guy had said non-random mutations, would likely have been a good synopsis of what he was saying. Of course, he didn't say this. No honest person would assume that this is what you mean when you say mutation. But if you want to act like someone else is an idiot for the purpose of looking smart, you could accuse them of this. That said, you can't accuse him of epigenetics when he fails to specify random mutations, because epigenetics do not involve mutations. Epigenetics refers to the fact that environmental factors can, at times, influence which genes are expressed without changing the genome itself, hence no mutation. This is possible because not all genes are expressed at all times, and environmental factors can change which genes are expressed at a given time. Not new genes, just genes that were previously unexpressed. This isn't even a form of evolution, and certainly isn't the consequence of non-random mutation. So, in a nutshell, this guy is arguing with someone who confesses to not knowing much about evolution. And then, when that guy says something that is essentially true about evolution, the grumpy guy pulls out a couple of terms that the naive guy will definitely not understand, and then will use them to bash that guy over the head. In other words, he was just being a jerk. There is a lot more to evolution than just mutation and natural selection, but that's a fine place to start. And this seems to be this guy's MO. I mean, here he is speaking to Aaron Raw, who is not naive about evolution, and doing roughly the same thing.
I'm shocked you're saying this. And you're on YouTube. Are you drunk or something?
So all you're going to
You're telling me did Darwin write about genetic drift?
Darwin didn't know about genetic
Exactly.
drift.
So Darwin's main idea was natural selection.
So Darwinian evolution refers only to what Darwin himself proposed,
No.
right? The Darwinian
No.
mechanisms, natural and sexual
Wait,
selection.
hang on, Aaron.
So that-
You're really embarrassing yourself here.
No, I'm not.
You're saying the primary driver of evolution is genetic drift?
Yes.
Okay. Do you know what I want you to do? I want you to go down the road to the Royal Society. You've just discovered something amazing because according to them, they believe Darwin was right. natural selection is the primary driving force. Of course, some of them disagree,
Darwin was right, and in his time he didn't know about genetic drift.
but Aaron, you're saying genetic drift is the primary factor?
Yes.
You need to write a paper and you need to challenge all the Darwinists.
Alright, so here he's accusing Aaron Ra of being drunk, or embarrassing himself, because he suggests that genetic drift is a primary driver of evolutionary change in populations. Which is true. And keep in mind, this guy is the one posting these videos of himself. It's not like he's being caught making these ignorant and unnecessarily rude statements. Nope. This is the side of his arguments that he wants to present to the world. And in case you're not aware of genetic drift, I'll explain it for a minute. So, alleles are different versions of a gene. Looking at our snakes from before, there is an allele that codes for pigments to attach to the skin and scales, and there is a different allele that codes for those pigments not to attach to the skin and scales, called leucism. So those are alleles. The allele frequency is how prevalent an allele is in the population versus the total number of alleles for a given gene. For example, if I have a population of 5 snakes, one like this with 2 copies of the leucistic alleles, 3 like this with 2 copies of the not leucistic alleles, and 1 like this with 1 copy of each allele, then the allele frequencies would be 7 out of 10, or 0.7 for not leucistic, and 3 out of 10, or 0.3, leucistic. If possessing one or the other of these alleles increases the likelihood of reproducing, then the allele frequency for that allele will increase over time. And this is selection. It's not random. But let's say that a fire comes through and kills one of these and one of these. I would have no reason to suspect that their deaths had anything to do with their genes or colorations, just random chance. But the allele frequencies would change to 5/6 or 0.83333 repeating, and 1/6 or 0.166666 repeating. If a flood washed these 2 snakes to a new island where they started a new population, then the allele frequency of the new population would be 0.5 and 0.5. Heck, if these 2 bred and produced 2 offspring, which by random chance both inherited the leucistic allele from this parent, then the allele frequency would change from 0.75 and 0.25 to 1.0 and 0. In none of these cases did the allele frequency change because one of the alleles worked better than the other. It was just random chance. And a change in allele frequency caused by random chance is called genetic drift. And it's extremely common, especially in small populations. But who cares about being right when you could be undeservedly confident and rude?
What would you say is the possibility of life arising by random chance?
0. And in case you didn't hear me clearly, 0, nil, zip, nada. You can calculate the possibility, the probability of even forming a simple protein of a couple of hundred amino acids, and it's 1 in 1 followed by hundreds of zeros. That is mathematically impossible. The chances of complex molecules arising by chance from simple molecules in a natural environment is 0.
Alright, so while we're on the subject of abiogenesis, this presenter is asked about the possibility of life arising by random chance. And he responds that there is 0 chance. He backs this up by explaining that the probability of forming a simple protein of a couple of hundred amino acids is 1 in 1 followed by hundreds of zeros. It's mathematically impossible. This is a quarter. If I flip it 1 time, and assuming that this is a fair quarter, the probability of me flipping a tails, which is what I got, is 1 in 2, 50%, which is mathematically possible. If I flip it again and get a tails, well, the probability of that is 50% also, and the probability that I would get a tails and then another tails is 25%, which is possible, though the outcome of some other outcome was still higher. That said, the probability of any other specific outcome, any possible outcome, was also 25%. It could have been tails heads, heads tails, or heads heads. 25%. But the probability of some outcome, one of these 4 possible outcomes, was 100%. So it was a certainty that I would get some outcome, and that the probability of that outcome, whichever one it turned out to be, would have been 25%. So I was guaranteed to get some highly unlikely outcome. And it gets worse the more times I flip the quarter. If I flip it a third time, well, I'm guaranteed to get a sequence of heads and tails that only had a 12.5% chance of happening. If I flip it a fourth time, it drops to just 6.25%. You flip this coin just 10 times, and it drops to less than 0.1%. And if you flip that coin 100 times, the probability of getting the exact sequence of heads and tails that you will get, because you will get a sequence, but the probability of getting that sequence will be so remote that it's laughable. But is it really so inconceivable? And the same is true with a specific amino acid sequence. The probability of any specific amino acid sequence being produced by random mutations to the genetic code is impossibly small. But the probability of some sequence being produced is not nearly as far-fetched. So yes, if you assume that specific proteins had to be made, then the probability is so small as to deem it nearly impossible. If it's just a question of making some protein, some sequence of amino acids, then that is a totally different question and is much more probable. So this was pretty misleading.
Did you know Mount Everest proves the Bible to be true? Watch this.
11-foot oysters weighing 600 pounds, 2 miles above sea level in the Andes Mountains. When they climbed Mount Everest, they found petrified clams on top of Mount Everest. Interesting thing about these clams, they're petrified and they're closed. Now, I'd like to point out, Mount Everest is a little ways from the beach, first of all, okay? About 450 miles to the beach. And clams do not climb mountains very well. And when a clam dies, it opens. You can walk along the beach and find a million seashells. You hardly ever find a matched pair. And you never find them closed if they're dead. They open right away. How do you get petrified closed clams on top of Mount Everest? I think there was a flood.
Now, if you believe the Bible is the true written word of God, then follow or subscribe.
Okay, so the claim here is that Mount Everest proves that the Bible is true. But really, this isn't just about Mount Everest, but also the Andes Mountains, where I used to live. I used to live in Juliaca, Peru, and on the island of Amantani, which are both over 12,500 feet in elevation. And I never actually saw any oysters at that elevation, though there are a few species of bivalves in Lake Titicaca, so there might be oysters living that high today. But I don't think that there are any alive today that are 11 feet across. However, the speaker in this video reports that there are fossils of 11-foot, 600-pound oysters 2 miles above sea level in the Andes Mountains, and petrified closed clams on top of Mount Everest, 450 miles from the beach. He says that clams do not climb mountains, and that they open when they die. So the explanation for petrified closed clams on top of Mount Everest is that there was a flood that went over the top of Mount Everest. And assuming that all these claims are true about the clams and oysters being up there, it does mean that the rocks found at these elevations were, most likely, underwater at some point. And if the clams are closed and fossilized, it probably means that they were buried while they were alive. And one possible explanation is that the 29,000-foot summit of Mount Everest was, at one point, underwater. And clams either climbed the submerged mountain before being buried by an underwater landslide near the summit, or they were deposited on the summit by some other mechanism before this landslide took place. So that's one explanation. Or, perhaps, the mountain hasn't always been 29,000 feet tall. So let's take a look at where the Andes Mountains and Mount Everest are located. Mount Everest is about 450 miles from the beach. I think 430 miles is the shortest distance to the sea. So that is a heck of a hike. However, it is located right at the edge of the Eurasian plate. And it's interesting, but I haven't had the opportunity to talk to creationists about their position on plate tectonics. So I'm really not sure if they accept tectonic plates as being a thing or not. But according to mainstream science, until about 55 million years ago, where Everest is now was near the edge of Eurasia, probably near or under the ocean. until it was hit by the Indian plate, which had broken off from Gondwana in the Cretaceous about 100 million years ago. When plates collide, the formation of mountains is a common and predictable consequence. So the rocks that made up Mount Everest, which were on the coast, were, as a consequence of the collision with the Indian plate, thrust upward as the Indian plate subducted under the Eurasian plate. You get a very similar situation along the west coast of South America, where the South American plate and the Nazca plate collided. So one explanation is that the clams and oysters hiked up submerged mountains and then were buried near the top of these mountains. Or, alternatively, they were already fossils when these mountains formed. Guess I'll let you be the judge.
So evolutionary biology would say that birds and lizards, we all share a common ancestor that had an eye. Okay, so there's not a problem there, but you're right.
So I'm wrong about that.
You're wrong, but you're right on the bigger point that according to evolutionary science, they actually claim that the eye had to have evolved independently many different times in different lineages. Let me give you a really striking example. The octopus, okay? If you look at the design of the octopus eye, it has a camera type eye that has a design that is very, very similar to the vertebrate eye, the eye that's found in us or lizards or birds. It's a very, very similar eye. But if you try to figure out what did the common ancestor of the octopus, mollusks, and vertebrates, what did that ancestor have? Did it even have an eye? We don't know. There's no reason to think that that common ancestor had an eye, much less a camera type eye with a very, very similar design. And not only is the sort of the larger structural design of the eye similar, even some of the biochemistry of these eyes is very, very similar. So we're looking at what evolutionary scientists call convergent evolution. It's basically similarity that cannot be explained by common ancestry. And when we see these extreme examples of quote-unquote convergent evolution, I would say, and many scientists in our movement would say, that's better explained by common design than by sort of independent evolution or common ancestry. You can't explain it through some evolutionary mechanism. Common design based upon a common blueprint is a much more elegant way to explain that data.
Okay, so it seems that this conversation begins somewhere after an inaccurate claim was made that birds and lizards would have independently evolved eyes, which was corrected to explain that evolutionary biology would claim that they are both descendants of the same eyed ancestor, which is correct. We don't think that birds and lizards independently evolved eyes. But he then explains that while we don't think that birds and lizards independently evolved eyes, we do think that eyes evolved more than once. For example, there's no reason to suspect that the common ancestor of octopuses and vertebrates even had eyes, much less camera-style eyes, which is also correct. He then explains that the cephalopod and vertebrate eyes are not only similar structurally, but even some of the biochemistry is similar. And he correctly explains that the explanation for this is convergent evolution. And honestly, to this point, I think that he's pretty spot on. But then after explaining the evolutionary explanation for the similarity between these eyes, he says you cannot explain it through some evolutionary mechanism, which is clearly not true. And he says that the similarity is better explained by common design. Of course, there are a couple of ways that the cephalopod eye is better. For example, it features a movable lens to focus the eye instead of a lens that changes shape and thus loses its ability to focus as the lens hardens with age, and an optic nerve that does not pass through the retina, thus not making a blind spot. So if this is a case of common design, then clearly the designer does a better job sometimes than it does at other times. But the thing is that these eyes are different enough that they clearly have different origins. And you'd think that you would find this even in different, say, kinds of vertebrates, but you don't. You get the same basic design across vertebrates, even vertebrates that live in environments that are more like where you would find cephalopods than where most other vertebrates live, like you. In organisms that appear to be closely related, we get the same design. And then in organisms that appear to not be closely related, we get wildly different designs. This is reflected also in instances like the fact that a bat wing, a bird wing, and a pterosaur wing are all highly different. But they're all more similar in design to your hand or a whale's flipper than they are to, say, the wing of an insect. For some reason, the designer is reusing designs to do very different things in vertebrates, but reinventing the wing repeatedly in vertebrates and then again in insects. This would be a great way to do it if the designer wanted to try to convince us that these organisms are the product of evolution, but it doesn't make much sense otherwise. So I wouldn't say that this is the most elegant of explanations. And convergent evolution occurs because adaptations that are beneficial in one lineage are often beneficial in others. We really got deep into the evolution of eyes, if you're interested in eyes specifically, in our video about all of the cephalopods. But eyes have clearly been beneficial in multiple lineages, for reasons that aren't all that mysterious. And interestingly, while the same basic genetic code is used to form eyes across vertebrates, and despite the similarity in structure and function to those of cephalopods, the genetic pathway used to form them is completely different. A total redesign to end at a very similar design. I'd like to take a moment just to say thank you to our patrons at Patreon. Obviously, the first time we did one of these videos, it was pretty out there for us, and we are able to do experiments like this and venture into new lands and new realms and new types of content thanks to your support. So if you'd like to see us continue to grow and expand in the kinds of content that we can provide for you guys, or just all the amazing features we have for our patrons, please check it out.
You can believe that the Bible says the earth doesn't move. You can believe it, but you don't have to. You can believe that the earth is young and the universe is young.
Then the age of the earth and the universe, starting from the Bible, is 6,000 years.
But you don't have to, because the Bible doesn't claim it.
In the beginning, God created the skies and the land.
And then you have a sequence of days. In the Hebrew language, the first statement, in the beginning were the heavens and the earth was this and that, is made in one Hebrew past tense. The tense changes to another past tense for the description of the days. Now, what does that mean? Well, Professor Jack Collins, who was a scientist and is now the chief translator for the English Standard Version of the Bible, says, I quote, "It means that the first statement occurs at an indefinite period before the second." What does the Bible say about the age of the universe and the earth? Absolutely nothing. So why fight about it, folks?
I think this is a really important point. Does the Bible preclude the possibility that the earth is 6,000 years old? No, it doesn't. Is that the only possible way to understand those scriptures? Also no. Is the age of the earth even an important thing to know to achieve salvation? I don't believe so. So, can you believe that the earth is very young? Sure. But you don't have to. Can evolutionary biology and a belief in God be in conflict? Absolutely. But they don't have to. And if both are true, then I cannot imagine a better situation for the adversary of truth to promote than that whichever one you discover to be true first precludes the other from being a possibility. So if you want religious people to reject good science, it's a great position to push. If you want scientifically minded people to reject God, then this is a great position to push. But you don't have to. As always, like and subscribe, and we hope to see you real soon.
Clint.
Yo.
I couldn't help but notice that you referred to the person in the video as the speaker.
Yeah.
And did not mention him by name.
Yeah, I didn't get a lot into names in this whole thing.
I mean, you know, maybe you were just afraid of being whacked again.
Yeah.
Ooh.
I actually was a little bit disappointed that I wasn't whacked a third time after the third video.
Does that mean you won?
Yeah, I'm either unwhackable or finally realized I'm not an atheist.
They were going to make a new series of videos.
Yo, whack a fellow theist.
I love that. That just rolls off.
And it. Oh, please don't do that.
The snake did that?
Yeah.